Perhaps no mythology has captured the modern imagination as strongly as Norse mythology. Figures like Thor, Odin, and Loki are everywhere, from blockbuster films and video games to literature and even tattoos. Concepts like Yggdrasil, the Great World Tree, or Bifrost, the shimmering bridge between realms, are instantly recognizable. But that raises an important question. How much of what we know about Norse mythology is actually accurate? Where do these stories come from, and just how reliable are these sources, considering that Germanic paganism disappeared almost 1,000 years ago? In this video, we are going to explore the historical sources behind Norse mythology and ask ourselves whether or not these sources are trustworthy. Despite the vast array of content available today, almost everything we know about Norse mythology traces back to just two primary sources, the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. These two collections of Old Norse poems and stories were recorded in medieval Iceland. The Prose Edda was composed by Snorri Sturluson, an Icelandic chieftain, historian, and Christian scholar writing in the 13th century. And here is a problem: by the time Snorri wrote the Poetic Edda, Iceland had been officially Christianized for over 200 years. That alone should raise concerns about the authenticity of what we are reading. The version of Norse mythology that survived was filtered through a Christian worldview, compiled by people far removed, both in time and belief, from the pagan past they were describing. While scholars believe Snorri Sturluson composed the Poetic Edda in the 12th century, the oldest surviving copy of this work, the Codex Regius, was written in the late 13th century, more than a century after its supposed composition. Medieval manuscripts were copied by hand, often by monks or scribes with their own agendas or limited understanding of the source material. It is well documented that texts could change over time, not just in spelling or grammar, but in actual content. The Codex Regius, meaning the King's Book, is the most complete and widely used manuscript today, but even this version is centuries removed from the oral traditions it supposedly records. Let's take one example: Loki, the trickster god, the shapeshifter who seems to be such a central figure in present-day Norse storytelling. You might be surprised to learn that Loki is almost entirely absent from historical records, except just a few mentions in the Poetic Edda. Outside of a single brief mentioning in a skaldic poem, Loki appears nowhere in Viking Age inscriptions, runestones, or other documents. That's right, the figure of Loki, who now feels so central to Norse myth, is entirely dependent on the Eddas. If these two books had never been written or had been lost, Loki would likely be forgotten altogether. This calls into question how representative the Eddas really are of actual pre-Christian Germanic belief. How many of the stories were added, reshaped, or misunderstood by medieval Christians trying to preserve a fading tradition? We do have a few other fragments of Germanic mythology from elsewhere in Europe. For example, runestones, which often mention names like Thor or Odin. Roman historians like Tacitus, who described early Germanic tribes, though through a foreign lens. Old English and Old High German charms and texts that reference Germanic deities. But these are short, scattered, and rarely mythological in the narrative sense. They help confirm that gods like Odin and Thor were worshipped, but they don't provide stories or context. This brings us to a final, crucial point. The Norse and Germanic pagans did not have a robust writing tradition. Their myths were preserved orally, told and retold by poets known as skalds. Oral tradition is fluid. It evolves with each telling. Without fixed texts, stories are always in motion, shaped by memory, audience, and social change. When the Christian scribes finally recorded the myths, centuries after they were last part of active religious life, the material was already transformed. It is very likely that a 9th century Norse pagan would not recognize many of the stories we now call Norse myths. At the very least, he would know them in a vastly different form. Let's be clear, the Norse myths we read today in academic works, movies, or books, they are not Viking beliefs. Rather, they are reconstructions of oral stories written by Christian scribes centuries after the religion had already vanished. They are interpretations, not records. They are stories about myths, not the myths themselves. If you lived in the 10th century and spoke to a real Norse pagan, it's highly likely they would not recognize many of the stories you now think of as authentic. Loki might be unknown, the 9 worlds might sound strange, even Thor himself might appear in stories we've never heard or told in ways we wouldn't understand. What survives today is just a sliver, a snapshot, and a reinterpretation shaped by centuries of silence, Christian morality, and manuscript errors. So admire the Norse stories, enjoy them, but don't mistake them for undistorted truth. The real Norse mythology is a lost world. What we have are only echoes, beautiful, powerful echoes, but echoes nonetheless.